Hello. Yeah, so hopefully by the end of this talk, you all hate plastic and waste as much as I do, but I think that's going to be quite an ask. So what I want to talk about is Don't Be a Litterbug and its fairly sinister history. So whenever you think about waste, you probably think of Betty Draper from Mad Men, just whipping her picnic blanket and sending trash all over the park. But there's no way we get from this to stuff like this. So this is a beach in Papua New Guinea, just littered with plastic, right? And this is not an isolated instance around the world. Most of our beaches are just littered in plastic. And that's because we have got a huge problem with waste. So we produce a horrendous amount of rubbish. If you look at the scale of the problem, in 1950, we produced about 2 million tons of plastic a year. 37 years later, in 1987, we surpassed 100 million tons per year. Go us. It only took us another 12 years to breach the 200 million tons per year mark. Then 11 years after that, the 300 million tons per year mark. 6 years after that, 400 million tons, right? So we're producing a huge amount of waste. To put that in more context, is it's hard to think of that much per year. We like to accumulate and then split around ourselves. So by 2019, this was the last number I could get, we had produced 9.53 billion tons of waste, which is a huge amount of waste. If you measure that in cows, by 2022, that's 1.37 tons per person, which is the size of Australia's largest cow, witnessed here, which is an enormous cow. That is a beautiful bovine, if I've ever seen one. So imagine that following you around. Every one of you has one of those following you around just stuffed with plastic. So, what is going on? How did we even get to a point that we can have 1.4 tons of waste per person, right? I don't think we could even fill this room up with that many cows. It started with an idea. So bottles, they used to be valuable, okay? And you can see how valuable here. This bottle remains the property of Murray Brothers Beechworth and cannot be used by others, right? Or this bottle always remains the property of J.L. Bailey Bellingham. Please return empty bottle promptly, okay? We had a lot of materials in each of these bottles. Breweries, they had to get them back. That was the only way to remain competitive. If you look at the price of a Coke, which I learned something really interesting during this, the price of a Coke remained at 5 cents for 70 years. Isn't that insane? They started off being like the 5-cent drink, and that only actually ended in the 1950s. But that's kind of beside the point. What it was is you paid 3 cents for the liquid and 2 cents deposit for the bottle. So, that is a massive bottle deposit. That's 40% of the price is actually just in the glass that you then give back and you get your 2 cents back. And for beer, it was a little bit more. It was about 50% of the price of the bottle, or of the beer, was just the bottle, and you got that money back when you returned the bottle. So the only way breweries could really be competitive was by getting these bottles back. If you sent this bottle away, you wouldn't be able to really compete in the market because your beer would be twice the cost of your competitors, of your local competitors. So this meant a brewery could only really supply an area that a truck could travel. That was it. That was your area. This changed a little bit with the invention of the can in 1935 because cans have always been single use, but these cans, they had a few issues that needed to be sorted out, a couple engineering issues. Apparently they made the beer taste awful until they could figure out how to make the beer not react with the can or make the can not react with the beer. And then it was still cheaper to use a reusable bottle. For every dollar, I've got a little spelling mistake here, that it's meant to be 10 cans would cost you $1, or 12 bottles would cost you $1. So you'd actually get more beer if you were buying bottles. It's just you'd only really see that benefit once you'd returned the bottles. But ultimately, it was cheaper. So that's 20% more expensive already. So if you even tried to use cans, you are going to be uncompetitive in the market, as your beer was just going to be more expensive. Pabst would only use cans for export. So when you don't need to get them back, it's much better to use a can, just send it away. You don't have to worry about getting it back. It's single use anyways. But for any sort of domestic market, you really had to use bottles to be competitive. So someone asked the question, what if we didn't need to get the bottles back? And I'm going to take a very slight digression in a moment. Forgot which slide was coming up. So the benefits of single-use bottles is that it's cheaper, right? You use far less glass. You don't have to make these big, thick, heavy bottles anymore because you don't need them to be robust. You don't care if they break. You don't need them back anyways. So you can start taking advantage of economies of scale. You can have your breweries closer to where your actual materials come from. So they can be closer to the farm, so you don't have as many transportation costs, at least at that end. And then because you're serving a much larger area, you have a much larger customer base. And you also have a larger brewery, so you have fewer employees per liter of beer, essentially. Pretty much, to summarize that, cheaper beer and more customers equals money. Yep. But it does come with a couple of issues. One is that thinner bottles break more. Have you ever tried to smash some of those old bottles? Like, you could club a seal with that thing. They're like seriously hefty. And the other issue is that you really end the real bottle deposit. No longer is it 40% of the cost of the bottle. Now you're looking at New Zealand just failed to put a bottle deposit on. They wanted to do 20 cents per bottle, but that's only 5% of the cost of a Coke. So realistically, are you going to get people bringing these bottles back, or is it still just easier to toss them out? Yeah, I'd say you probably wouldn't get too much uptake at 20 cents. And this one here, internationally, it seems to be about 10 cents per bottle. And my guess, I could not find any information on this, but my guess is that's less than the cost of the actual bottle. So there's just no more resources in these bottles. No more reason to get it back. The raw materials just aren't worth it. So this is my digression that I was trying to get to. So if you look at the 1873, the U.S. had about 4,000 and something breweries. My guess is that major dip there on the left-hand side is probably due to trains. Again, I couldn't find any information, but as the rail networks got set up, breweries could supply larger areas. Then you had it pretty stable up to the point that trucks were invented, and then you have a bit of a decline after trucks were invented all the way to Prohibition, which, of course, during Prohibition, they didn't have any breweries. Then you had a boost up pretty much to where it left off before Prohibition. After Prohibition ended, you have a bit of a spike during World War II, where the U.S. was probably exporting a lot of beer. Remember, cans were invented in 1935. They could suddenly actually be quite affordable and send beer all over the place that was being bombed and destroyed. Then the U.S. enters the war. All the young men go off to war. You have fewer employees and less of a beer market because everyone's away fighting. And then you start to have this decline from the 1940s. And I think that is where you had the single-use bottles really coming in. And this led to a bit of an issue where, last digression slide. By 1978, there were only 100 breweries in the States, owned by 50 companies. So you went from 4,000 in the 1800s all the way through to sort of around 2,000 through the early 1900s, 600 kind of in the 1940s, down to 100 in the 1970s. So this really shows you the value that people got out of single-use products. You could serve just a much larger area. So something happened in the 1950s. Thinner bottles without the deposit scheme meant that people, when they were finishing off their brew on the way home, they wouldn't bother keeping the bottles anymore. They would just toss them. Sometimes these ended up in farmers' fields, sometimes in haystacks. And even though grass and glass are only 1 letter different, they have a very different effect on a cow's digestion. And cows were getting quite badly hurt. Farmers were not happy about this. And Vermont, in 1953, did the very first single-use packaging law, where they said, no more single-use bottles, which, solved the problem. And now that's why we don't have a big cow following us around full of plastic, right? Unfortunately not, because every good story needs a villain. Keep America Beautiful was founded in 1953, and no, that is not a coincidence. It's the same year as the Vermont law, and it was founded by the Owens, Illinois Glass Company and the American Can Company, and then they got on a few heavy hitters, Coca-Cola, Dixie Cup, and the National Association of Manufacturers. Now, if you actually look at Keep America Beautiful's website, it's sort of like a most wanted list for environmentalists. It's just like, it's packed full of all sorts of people who are doing quite a lot of harm. And they started a really massive ad campaign. In the first couple of years, I think they had reached 70 million people, which I didn't even look up what the population of the States was at that time, but it couldn't have been that much more than 70 million people. And that is where we get Don't Be a Litterbug. They had these big campaigns that said, it's not a production issue, it's a disposal issue. They shifted the blame from the production onto the consumption and the disposal. And by 1957, they succeeded. They quashed that law, and we have never had another single-use packaging law since that point. But they wanted to make sure that they were never regulated again. So for the next 75 years, they've been pushing the same messaging, shifting the responsibility from the production onto the consumption. And they have some pretty good ads. This one here, Every Little Bit Hurts, Keep America Beautiful, Are You a Litterbug? Which actually, I have a bit of a question. Who here is a litterbug? Put up your hand. Who litters wantingly? Yeah, sometimes. Yeah, okay, that's fair. Yeah. They even got Lassie involved. I don't know which Lassie this was of the 7 or 8 Lassies, but Lassie doesn't want you to litter either. And one of the really strange things about it is they really did target children. So they had these trash monsters at the side of highways, right, which children really liked feeding the trash monster, right? And probably the last time you heard Don't Be a Litterbug was probably in primary school, right? And for what reason, it has remained one of the major areas that people learn not to litter and everything. I guess, where else do you play marbles, right? Old things happen to just stay in primary schools for whatever reason. Most famously, they had this ad from 1971. I don't know how I play this. Do you know how I? No. Maybe, can I push? Maybe? Nope. Okay, well, it's... Look it up at home. Yeah, you've probably seen it in popular culture, that it's a Native American. In this case, he's actually Italian, which has caused a bit of controversy, but beside the point. He paddles down a river that's strewn with trash. His factories billow smoke in the background. He hops out, and he's walking over to the highway, which is littered, like tons of trash everywhere, and a motorist throws a bag of trash at his feet, and a voice says something along the lines of, "You make the problem. You produce trash. Only you can solve the problem." As he turns to the camera and a single tear rolls down his cheek, right? So there you go, dramatic telling. So why did this happen? Why did companies do this? Well, you get the economies of scale and externalizing costs of production, which I would have loved to tell you guys all about negative externalities, but you would not leave. Like, I would take all night, so very good question to ask me at the end. So yeah, for companies, it was money. You can have much larger operations servicing a much larger area, more customers, more money. For individuals, it's just easier, right? It is a bit of a pain having to lug the stuff back, even though it's got immense value. Everything looked cheaper, right? If you went to the store and you got to buy 10 cans for $1, or it would have been 12 at the end of the situation, but at the start it was only 6, right? Because the cost of those 3, when it was initially 25 cents, it would actually be 50 cents on the shelf. But you got half of that money back when you returned the bottles. So initially it looks cheaper, but it actually isn't. And that has remained. It's still cheaper to reuse rather than just have single use. You get a lot more diverse products because you can get products from further away. And you also get to externalize some of the costs. And a lot of that is around tips, right? But we'll get to that if someone asks the question. So let's just get to the conclusion. If you take a step in the wrong direction, a step backward, if you make a wrong turn, I will get this quote right. If you make a wrong turn, a step backward is a step in the right direction. And that's what we really need to do. We need to look back to how we did things before things really got corrupted in terms of how we use products, to get back to how we did things in the 1940s, 1950s, or earlier. And Keep America Beautiful was formed with 2 goals in mind. One was to crush regulation and to prevent themselves from being regulated in the future. And really, when it comes to regulation, when it comes to solving this problem, I think regulation is the only way to do it, because you cannot bring everyone on board for the same issue, right? It's just that's too big a goal. You're better to vote theoretically against your own best interest, like vote for me, I want to make your life harder, but it's really the only way to solve this problem. And finally, you are not the litterbug. The entire system is the litterbug. It's been built without having any alternative to excessive waste. This system carries enormous risk for our future. I didn't get into that part either, because it's just too much to talk about, but a really good question. And it must be changed, and regulation, not us, is the only way to change it. Thank you.
And we have time for some questions.
Yeah, question.
Yes.
What do you want to talk about?
Oh. So topic 1 is negative externalities. If you haven't heard that term, it's an amazing term. It is what is the additional cost that is not incorporated in the producer-consumer relationship. So, for example, when you take your rubbish and you put it in the bin, it doesn't just magically disappear, right? It needs to be taken to a landfill and it needs to be stored. And you're only really paying for the immediate costs of that landfill. That stuff's going to have to be there for potentially hundreds of years, maybe even thousands of years. So think of that land rental cost that you're not actually having to pay for. You have to pay for a portion, and you have to pay for everyone that littered or threw out waste before you got here. But it's a cost that really gets carried forward to future generations. So that is a nice big negative externality. Yeah.
So some changes have been put in place, like getting rid of plastic bags and things like that,
Mm-hmm.
that lead to other forms being used as single-use things. What would you say is the biggest changes we can make to actually make an impactful difference?
Very good question. So, personally, I think the biggest thing we need to do is actually get rid of plastics, because plastics themselves are really, really harmful. So, there's a chemical called BPA, which you'll see BPA free on a lot of water bottles and that sort of thing. The reason why BPA came about as being an issue is some studies were done and they found that it was related to a decline in sperm counts, right? So men nowadays, unfortunately, we have about half the sperm count of our grandfathers, which is really not a good thing. They had about 100 million, we have about 50 million, and that was linked to BPA. So there's also one other pretty bad consequence, and when you Google this, I recommend Safe Search on. The anogenital distance in men is decreasing, and largely because of BPA and related to the sperm count issue. That means that men these days are a little bit less manly than their grandfathers were as well. There's a shrinkage of male genitalia size, and that's linked to plastic as well. So, sorry guys for the sperm count, sorry ladies for everything else. Yeah. But there are tons and tons of issues like that around plastics that we probably don't have time to get into, but we can talk about it later. Yeah. Okay. Oh, question at the back?
What are some things that we can do individually, you think?
Didn't you listen to the entire talk? Yeah. Yes, individually, it's important to try to minimize your waste as much as possible. But if ever you hear of a politician saying something along the lines of, oh, we should probably regulate waste, the most impactful thing you can do is probably send that person an email and say, yes, whatever you want, yes, let's do this, right? Because we really need support in that direction, and we need to give people confidence to regulate industries when there's a huge amount of money that is involved with keeping this same system going, right? It is, whoever decides to end this is going to be a very unpopular person from a lot of people. Yeah. Yep.
So there's been a bit of a shift from not having, getting away from plastics, things like biodegradable plastics, etc. And on the other side, there's solutions like waste to energy, etc. Get rid of that help entirely. So is that an acceptable substitute, in your opinion, to trying to change consumer behavior, or is that just another attempt to...
Yeah, I've been burnt too many times. Unfortunately, a lot of these bioplastics and compostable plastics and stuff like that, they might be a little bit better, but they're not actually going to fix the problem of waste. The only way to fix the problem of waste is to not produce waste, right? And if you look at how quickly waste is accelerating, even if we replace it with something else, it's still going to be massively harmful. So, yeah, we're better to just circumvent that whole argument and just get back to reusable packaging, carrying your own takeaway containers when you want to get a takeaway, or paying a deposit for a container that then you can bring back later. Give it back to the restaurant, get some of your money back, right? That's really, I think, the way forward. Yeah.
One quick question. So what is New Zealand doing in terms of regulations at the most?
Well, the last thing I heard was when we didn't do the bottle deposit, and that was in March. So not a lot, probably. Yeah.
What actually happens with the landfill land? Like, I'm just disposing my rubbish, and what happens after? Like,
What happens to your rubbish, you mean?
yes, it's like...
So there's a couple different avenues it can go down, right? It can either be go into the red bin, or it can go into the yellow bin. Largely, those lead to the same place. Yeah, because only about, I think, 7 to 9% of plastics actually gets recycled, and it's simply because there's no value in these materials. When you recycle plastic, you actually don't recycle it, you downcycle it, because plastic degrades through the process of recycling. It gets heated and the molecules break down. So, yeah, you can turn like a plastic bottle with a whole bunch of other bottles. You could probably remake some plastic bottles, but eventually it's going to become a carpet, and when it becomes a carpet, it's never going to become a bottle again. So ultimately, all of that, everything you've ever seen, becomes waste at some point, right? Doesn't matter what it is, it will become waste, and you can have more harmful forms of waste, which plastic is one of those forms, or you can have more benign forms of waste, like glass, which ultimately becomes sand again at the end of its life. Yeah.
I think that's a great place to end. So thank you so much, Hugh, for speaking.